Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. So it's no secret that I am a big fan of different controllers. It's one of the biggest things I focus on when I'm reviewing retro handheld devices. And I've created quite a collection of random controllers over the years. And most of these have their own specific use. But the thing is, I really kind of love each one of these for their own reasons. And the surprising thing is I've probably gotten rid of more controllers than I actually own. I guess I'm pretty picky about how things feel in my hands. But one of the things I don't like about having all these controllers is that none of them do everything. And so I've kind of started this little quest to try to pare down these controllers down to something a little bit more manageable. And by doing that, I'm trying out newer controllers. And so today we're going to review this controller here. It's called the Elitist S by a company named BIGBIG. And before we get into the nitty-gritty of the review, I do want to say that I'm really impressed by how much this delivers for a $45 product. And I can use this controller on just about everything I'm looking for. It's fully compatible with Nintendo Switch, there are multiple ways you can connect it to Windows PCs, it has the full spectrum of Apple support, and you can also use it with Android, and that includes all the Android TV boxes like Super Console X. So in this video, we're going to take a deep dive, look at everything I like about this device, some of the things I don't really like about it, and we'll just go from there. So without any further delay, let's knock it out. Okay, so here's the box here. Let's do a quick unboxing. I have to say overall, the marketing seems to be pretty good on this device, but admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of the name of this company as well as the controller itself. They just seem kind of generic to me. I'd rather the controller had a specific name in English that was somewhat iconic. Something like Elitist S doesn't really mean anything to me other than it sounds like they're trying to knock off Microsoft. Inside the box, you're going to find a fairly good manual here. I actually ended up referring to it a few times, and that's a pretty big win, because usually I try to figure everything out myself. As far as accessories, you get a 2.4 GHz USB connector here. That's going to come in really handy for certain devices. And then unfortunately it has a micro USB charging cable, but my understanding is that micro USB is a little bit better for low latency connections. So first impressions of the controller, it reminds me of the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. It just kind of has that flat face to it, and those face buttons also remind me of it. And the analog sticks are also offset like they are on the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, as well as the Xbox controllers. Personally, I like to have offset analog sticks, but I think that's really going to be a matter of preference. The analog sticks themselves are very bouncy and responsive. They're a lot like Xbox analog sticks. But I really like these triggers. These triggers are a lot like the Xbox One triggers, and I like how they have that sharp point to them. It makes it really easy to rest your fingers on it. On the back it has two rear buttons. And I really like the setup of these. I like the fact that they're sticking out just a tiny bit, and they're kind of hard to push down. Like, you have to deliberately do it. It's not like something you're going to accidentally push while you're playing a game. On the back here, it has a handy guide to show you how to pair with the various systems that it supports. It doesn't show iOS on here because it wasn't available at the time of the printing, but it has been updated by firmware now. And connecting to Apple devices is very easy. You just hold down the B button and the pair button to pair. Now, overall feel in the hand, this does feel very balanced. It's pretty easy to reach all of the buttons as well as the analog sticks. Now on the bottom there's a switch that allows you to remove the back plate here. And I'm not really sure of the purpose behind this, because you can't access the battery or anything else like that, so I'm not really sure why this is removable. Perhaps there are going to be plans to add additional modules later on, I'm not really sure. So let's start doing some comparisons with modern controllers. We'll start with the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. And I want to start with this one because they look so similar. And they almost look like the exact same size. They're about the same width, and I think the grips at the bottom flare out about the same amount. But if you stack them up next to each other, you'll see that the Nintendo Switch Pro controller is significantly shorter than this Elitist S controller. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, but it does give you a good comparison if you do have a Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Now, holding a Nintendo Switch Pro controller is a little bit of a different experience. And that's mostly because it doesn't have those back buttons. It feels very smooth and kind of rigid on the back. It's kind of like holding a sandwich that happens to have grips on it. It's just a very flat experience. I think the Elitist S controller here just allows you to naturally grip this a little bit better. Part of that has to do with the way you hold your fingers in order to use the back buttons. But in general, I just found myself gripping this a little bit more comfortably than the Nintendo Switch Pro controller. Now let's try the PS4 controller. These also have similar widths to them, but obviously the PS4 controller is much shorter. Now the grips on the PS4 controller are much more pronounced. You really do wrap your fingers around it, and it does feel natural to kind of hold these two sticks. In general, I would say the PS4 is probably the easiest of all these controllers when it comes to accessing all of the buttons and triggers. With this Elitist S, you have to do a little bit of stretching to hit every single button, and the way the grips are situated, you kind of hold your hands out a little bit flatter, like your knuckles are not pointed to the ground as much. It's just a very slight variation in the way you hold it, but if you hold them right next to each other, you'll definitely notice the difference. Now let's compare it against an Xbox One controller. It's kind of hard to compare the sizes between these two controllers because the Xbox One controller has kind of a weird shape to it, but it is definitely smaller than this Elitist S1. The thing about the Xbox One controller, the way the grips are situated as well as the buttons are pushed a little bit more towards the center, it really angles your hands towards kind of a V shape. And that's also a very comfortable position to be in because it naturally flares out your elbows. On the Elitist S controller, you're not flaring in as much because the sides of the controller itself are not angled as much. It's really just a matter of adjustment at this point. I don't think any of these feel necessarily bad, but you may have a specific preference, and that's how these all compare against one another. And just a quick comparison here between the different triggers, you can see that the Xbox One controller has almost the exact same triggers as the one on this Elitist S1, and I love both of these triggers. Okay, let's do a quick weight comparison. The Elitist S averages out at about 225 grams altogether. It definitely does not feel like a heavy controller. Let's compare that against my Xbox One S controller. This one has the batteries in it, and it's 292 grams right now. Now the PS4 controller, fully charged, is about 218 grams, so it is a little bit lighter than the Elitist S1. And the Nintendo Switch Pro controller is a little bit heavier at 248 grams. Now if you take something like the Xbox Elite controller here, this is 350 grams, much heavier of a controller. And I've always kind of liked the heaviness of this controller, but it can get a little bit more tiring than the other ones. Now on the other end of the spectrum, let's try some lighter controllers. Here's my 8BitDo SN30 Pro controller. It's only 115 grams, so almost half the weight of this Elitist S controller. Same thing here with your generic Super Console X controller. I don't really like these at all, but just to give you a weight comparison, it's 133 grams. So going back to this Elitist S controller, at 225 grams, it's kind of in that middle ground. It's lighter than an Xbox controller, but heavier than a PS4 controller. So now let's talk about the feel of face buttons. Since you're going to be pushing these the most, it's really important to kind of get an understanding of how these are going to feel. Overall, I like the size of these buttons. They're pretty big, and they're nice and responsive, and they feel very professional. Now the other face buttons like the Start and Select, they have a clickier feel to them, but I kind of prefer that. That means you have to really push down on them in order to access them. Now moving over to the D-pad, there's not a lot of travel with that. That was the first thing I noticed, is that it didn't really move up and down that much. But it still feels nice and clicky, and I think there is a rubber membrane underneath this, and it'll probably loosen up over time. And like I mentioned with the analog sticks earlier, they are definitely bouncy and responsive, and they stick out quite a bit, but I think that's a good thing because it gives you more control. Now moving over to these back buttons, they definitely have a clicky feel to them, but like I said before, I really like the feel of these, because you really have to be deliberate in pushing down on them. I like the fact that I'm not going to ever accidentally push down on these buttons. Now here's the PS4 face buttons. These are much smaller buttons, and I feel like they have a bit of a looser feeling to them than the Elitist S controller. They don't really feel that bad or anything, but they don't feel quite as responsive. I've never been a huge fan of the PS4 controller here, the fact that all the four buttons are a little bit separated, so I'm thankful that the Elitist S controller is not like this. Now the face buttons of the Xbox One controller are a totally different experience because the controller is a little bit more rounded, and these are very responsive and very springy buttons. And the D-pad on an Xbox controller is in kind of a concave shape, and so it gives you a little bit more travel than you do on the Elite S controller. Now I think the Nintendo Switch Pro controller has the most comparable buttons. These are actually the exact same size as the ones on the Elitist S, and they have the same amount of springiness. The D-pad has about the same amount of travel, but it's a little bit more mushy feeling. The D-pad on the Elitist S controller is just a little bit more stiff, and like I said before, it doesn't have a ton of travel, but I still think it's a precise feel. But yeah, I really like these face buttons. They feel good. I like that they're these big round buttons like this, and the amount of responsiveness in them is just about perfect. Now pairing this controller with an Android device is very easy. You hold down the A button as well as the pairing button, and then it'll appear in your Bluetooth settings, and you just tap on it to connect. So we'll do a quick test here with my new phone, which is an LG V20. This is a phone that I'm using dedicated for emulation. I'll do more videos on this later. But as you can see here, it's playing really well. And it turns out I actually really liked using the D-pad when it came to games like this. Because the D-pad is so precise, it's very good for racing games for me. And same goes with emulator apps here. You can see I'm playing Nintendo 64. And the controls here work really well. The only issue I had with this F-Zero game in particular is that it requires the use of the analog stick, and it took me a while to kind of adjust to the sensitivity of that stick. But I think that happens with any controller really. Now, when it comes to Nintendo Switch integration, this controller really shines. It's super easy to pair. You actually pair it just like you would a Nintendo Switch Pro controller, and it works seamlessly with the device. Basically, everything that you do with the Nintendo Switch Pro controller is the same thing you do on this one. The home button works perfectly. You can actually put it to sleep and wake it using this controller, which is not very common with other Bluetooth controllers that work with the Switch. And I felt like the latency was really good on this. In order to judge latency, I always use Mario 3 and I do something called the tail test. I try to hit these first Goombas with my tail right in the center, and as you can see here, I knocked it out of the park. Now, in order to connect to other devices, you can use a 2.4 GHz wireless dongle. And that's what I'm using here to connect to my Odroid Go Super. And Emulec picked it up just perfectly, which means you'll be able to use this controller for a number of different devices, like the Super Console X, or any other Android TV box that can run Emulec. And that's really exciting because this is so much better than those generic controllers that come with those devices. Now the controller has a few extra features, so I'll knock those out really quick here. If you press this function button here on the bottom with any other button, it'll make that button turbo. So you can see here I'm making my tail turbo. In order to turn it off, you just hit the function button again. And there it is. You can also assign any button to the back button. What you do is you hold down the function button as well as the back button for about 3 seconds. After that, you push whatever button it is you want to map to the back button, and then you hit the back button again to lock it in. So here I've mapped the A button to the back right button. So now I can jump without having to push the A button. So for example, I can just hold on to the B button and then use the A button when I want to jump. So that way I don't have to push 2 buttons with the same finger. You can also program macros with this. What you do is you hold on the function button and any other button. I'm going to use the back button. And then you do whatever move you want to do, and then you hit the back button again. So you can see here I just mapped the fireball sequence for Ken. And it's not perfect, but every time I'm pushing on this back button, it tries to throw a fireball. And you're probably going to have to practice getting this macro just right when you do the recording. But if there's a certain repetitive motion you use in a specific game, this will take care of it for you. And it's very easy. You don't have to use any external software, which I really appreciate. Alright, so wrapping things up, let's talk about what I like and what I don't like. We'll start with what I like. Number 1, this feels very professional. It feels like a first-party controller. I think that quality-wise, this actually stands toe-to-toe with some of those other bigger companies. I like the variety of connections you can do, so it has Bluetooth 5.0. You can also use a USB 2.4 GHz wireless connector, which will give you a little bit less latency. And you can also just use a wired USB connection as well, which will give you even less latency. So you have a lot of choice when it comes to how you want to connect to your various devices. And I've said it a few times now, but I think the triggers are really nice on this. And that might be because I've always been partial to the Xbox controller triggers. I think the turbo and the macro options are pretty handy. I don't think I'm personally going to use them very often, but it's nice that they're there and I don't have to use any external software. But something I definitely am going to use a lot are those custom back buttons. I love assigning jump buttons to that right back trigger. It's something I used to do when I played Destiny a few years ago all the time. And finally, I'm just kind of amazed that this thing only costs $45. After playing with it for a while, I was convinced it was a $60 controller. When I saw $45, I was pretty surprised. And I think that says a lot about how good this controller is. Okay, so those are all the things I like about this controller. Let's talk a little bit about what I don't like about it. And there's not quite as many of those. Number 1, I'm not really a fan of having to use a micro USB cable for this. I don't plan on using it for a wired connection, and so I just would rather use a USB-C for charging this. Luckily, the battery lasts about 30 hours, so I don't have to charge it very often. I'm not a huge fan of the front design of this controller. It seems very like gamery, you know, like they thought that this is something we would like to see, but honestly, it's just a little tacky to me. The pairing button that's on the top of it is a little bit sunken in, so it's kind of hard to push down on it, and I'm definitely being nitpicky about this, but I just wish it stuck out just a tiny bit more so it's easier to pair different things. And finally, I'm not sure where to put that little USB dongle. Like, where am I going to put that when I'm not using it? I think I'm probably just going to plug it into my Super Console X and just leave it in there all the time so that way I never lose it. Luckily, it does have the company's name written on it, so in case I find it randomly at some point, at least I'll know what it's for. So yeah, at the end of the day, I walked away from this controller really impressed. When I initially decided to pick it up, I really didn't have very high expectations for it. I thought that it had a lot of good connectivity options to it, but I really didn't expect it to feel as good as it does. I'm pretty sure that anytime I play any sort of Windows PC games, anything on my Switch, or anything on the Super Console X, this is the controller I'm going to grab first. And I'm still kind of stunned that this thing only costs $45. It's crazy. Well everyone, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and let me know what you think of this controller in the comments below. Is this something you might be interested in picking up, or are there other controllers out there that I just haven't tried yet that are even better than this? I think that this controller has a great balance between price and quality, but I'm really interested to hear if you have other ideas about better solutions as well. As always, thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming!